Morning, good afternoon, good evening. There is a new scramble for Africa. I think there's a lot of truth in that. To be quite honest, I think Africa, ever since the slave trade, has been jumping from one problem to another. With the slave trade, then there was the scramble for Africa, ending up with literally all African countries being colonized and exploited, with the last colonial control ending in 1994 with the independence of South Africa. But ever since, most Africans had already fallen victim to a new scramble. We'll just have a quick listen to this video where this explaining what this new scramble is all about. Excuse me, technology.
Our next story is about Africa and a battle taking place over the continent, a shadowy battle for influence. Now, as most of you know, Africa suffered under European colonization. It was known as the Scramble for Africa. The continent was carved up by Western powers and mercilessly exploited. Even today, the scars of European colonization, it was known as the Scramble for Africa. The continent was carved up by Western powers and mercilessly exploited. Even today, the scars of that colonization are very visible. But before the old wounds could fully heal, a new scramble has already begun. The key players are Russia, China, and the US. They're not looking to colonize Africa this time. What they are doing is expanding their influence by offering economic assistance. It's an old trick. Come in with promises of aid and then stick around for the resources. The entire African continent has seen this before, but they clearly haven't learned from history. This week, the US sealed two deals in two different corners of the continent, Tanzania in the east and Ghana in the west. Let's start by looking at Tanzania. It is in East Africa. The largest city there is Dar es Salaam. It is home to the nation's largest port. In fact, it is Africa's fourth largest port on the Indian Ocean side, making it extremely important for trade. And the US wants to take advantage of this. So it has offered to pay $250 million to develop a railway line through Tanzania. Now, $250 million is no joke. So why is the US being so generous? Two reasons. First, it will help American trade via the Lobito corridor. Lobito is a port city on the other side of Africa in Angola. The US is developing a port there too and creating a rail corridor that begins there. This railway line will pass through four African nations: Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, and then finally Tanzania. The corridor will cut through the entire African continent, connecting the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans. And that's not all. It will also link ports with mines, the ports of Lobito and Dar es Salaam, with mines in the DRC and Zambia. Now, when you join the dots, what do you see? A grand plan to exploit Africa's mineral wealth. This is America's plan. And Tanzania was the last part of the puzzle, hence the $250 million investment. This is the first reason. The second reason is the scramble for influence in Africa. And here the US is competing with China. China already has a strong presence in the region. It has multiple mines in Zambia. It is also investing in railway stations and renovations. So the US is basically playing catch-up. And with this latest move, Washington will be hoping to one-up Beijing. How will China respond? Well, it already has. You see, for years, China was pouring money all over Africa, approving loans worth over $10 billion every year. But those loans dried up. They were on the decline since 2016. But recently, that trend has changed. A new study is out. It says last year, China increased its lending to Africa. It is definitely wary about losing influence. Meanwhile, the US is doubling down on its Africa plans. I mentioned their second victory in Ghana. Look at this press release from the US State Department. It announces a landmark commercial agreement with Ghana for a small nuclear reactor project. Now, Ghana has been trying to get a nuclear reactor for a while now, and it has been weighing up offers from 5 countries: China, South Korea, France, Russia, and the US. Companies from these 5 countries were bidding for the contract. Now, it seems the American company has won. The agreement was signed yesterday. This is a major win for the US. It has been lagging behind in the African nuclear race. It's been losing out to Russia in a number of countries. At one point, Moscow looked unbeatable in Africa, but now Washington has pulled off an upset. Russia and China won't take this lying down, though. Beijing is already handing out more loans. Moscow may take similar actions. The only thing we can say for sure is that the new scramble for Africa is on.
This is a fact we cannot deny. Benjamin, new scramble for Africa.
Good day to everybody. Good day to you. Well, it's not new. I mean, we have been living in this era for quite some time now. You know, it's not very surprising that this is what is taking place. But you know, we shouldn't deny the fact that the world has evolved. Trade has left us in such a situation. Getting FDIs, foreign direct investment, is a very good thing, but it all comes down to good governance. What are we doing with our share, of that investment? Because surely, nobody just comes and mines for free. That's a fact. We are getting paid some kind of some kind of fee for the exploitation. But what are we doing with that fee is where it comes to at the end of the day. We cannot deny the fact that we need to trade with others.
Well, the main problem with this new scramble for Africa's resources is that one can trace it back to the slave trade itself. The reason why Africa became a supplier of slaves is because Africa was considered to be the weakest. The African governments were weak. And this is the exploitation that results from the failure to govern ourselves. When slavery was abolished, soon after, we had the scramble for Africa by the European countries, where literally every part of Africa was colonized. And the last colonial control entered 1994 with the independence of South Africa, the end of apartheid. And we are hardly 30 years down the line, and already we are talking of a new scramble. And it all emanates from African countries' failure to govern themselves, leaving them weak, ready to be exploited. The documentary we've just seen there was produced by India. India was one of the other countries that were also colonized. But when they gained their independence, they were able to run their affairs competently and to play on the world stage with confidence, to take their place on the table with confidence. We in Africa were failed to do so. Zimbabwe, we have got every reason to be ashamed of ourselves. Zimbabwe is a failed state. In 1980, we had one of the best economies in Africa, some of the best hospitals, roads, infrastructure, etc. Today, Zimbabwe is considered to be one of the poorest countries on the continent. And it's all because of bad governance. And it is no surprise that countries like China helped Zimbabwe gain its independence and used that as the ticket to come into the country, and have been exploiting that country ever since. That is the tragedy of Zimbabwe. As much as we can say we don't want this new scramble, as long as we remain a country that cannot govern itself, I really don't see how this will ever end. This is the tragedy that will never end.
Another important factor that we should also consider that is at play here is our failure to add value to our raw materials. We know that Africa is blessed with abundant raw materials, be it gold, just to name a few. We have failed to process, to add value to the raw material. So we are giving it out for free to those that have the equipment. We do not have an excuse because, like I said, with foreign direct investment, you get, a share of the wealth. It may not be, a big chunk, but it can get you to build processing plants such that, given, for example, Zimbabwe has been independent for 44 years now, and it had, processing plants that were in place, but you would have expected the government that inherited, after independence to build upon those and actually have better systems in place. But that didn't take place. We actually failed to maintain that which was there, the processing plants that were there. Thus now we have absolutely nothing in terms of even how to mine. Everything is being mined, for example, by the Chinese, and the Chinese have the say of how they want to carry their produce. And at the end of the day, we as Zimbabweans are losing out from our failure to add that value and our failure to get machinery to do some of these things for ourselves. Most major mining companies in Zimbabwe are foreign owned. Zimbabwe, basically, I would say we are just, in the Makorokoza sector, small scale. We really don't have anything of ours that is big. We used to have Zisco Steel. We used to have Lancashire Steel. We used to have, Mangura. We used to have big companies, that were functional in Zimbabwe, but we have since failed that. So now we have got these Chinese companies that have all the say, because once they pay us our share, instead of opening up our factories, our industries, we decide to build parliaments, we decide to buy motor vehicles, we decide to buy houses and give away loans amongst ourselves, which adds absolutely no value. You know, those that take over.
I think the reality is, in this scramble for Africa's resources, being controlled by the Chinese and Russians is another added burden, because the Chinese and the Russians are the least interested in good governance. The Chinese, in particular, of all the foreign nations in Zimbabwe that have had influence in Zimbabwe's internal affairs, the Chinese probably have had the greatest influence. There can be no doubt that the Chinese have helped Zanu PF stay in power these last 44 years. They've helped prop up the regime to make sure that it stays in power. It rigs elections and stays in power. And this is the unfortunate reality. Right now, the Mnangagwa Zanu PF regime is so tied up with the Russians and Chinese. They will not want to hold free, fair, and credible elections. And these two big nations, Russia and China, will bend over backwards to make sure that Zanu PF, even if it blatantly rigs the elections, it's never punished for it. So our fight for a meaningful say in the governance of the country, which is the only way we're going to ever change Zimbabwe, so that we do not continue to be exploited by outsiders, is if we can change our system of government. But that is not going to happen, because both Russia and China have invested interest in making sure that Zimbabwe remains an autocracy, that Zanu PF continues to rig elections to stay in power at all costs. So the new scramble for Africa, for some of us in Zimbabwe, this happened actually 40 years ago. And in the last 4 decades, countries like China have consolidated their hold on Zimbabwe. Mnangagwa swears by the Chinese, and they know it, and they're taking full advantage of it. And as for meaningful independence, I think we are a long way off getting it. I think that, to me, is one of the tragedies of Zimbabwe. That is where we are.
In conclusion, I would say, Zimbabwe is getting loans from both Russia, China, and so forth. But instead of adding value, like I was saying, Zimbabwe has decided, no, with our part of the loan, we are going to build for example, uh, the new parliament building, and we are going to give each other loans. A loan is supposed to be paid back. And if you cannot service your loan, obviously, the person that gave you that money now has a hold over you. So now you find, for example, Zimbabwe, it cannot service loans. Hence, now they're giving mining rights to China, 10-year rights, you know, do as much as you want. I mean, that there is a very, very big deal. It's poor management. It's poor thought. So at the end of the day, I would say poor governance has left Africa up for grabs. It may not be the Chinese, it may not be the Russians but somebody will definitely come and exploit, because it's open, it's an open check. Failed, we have failed ourselves. We have failed to govern ourselves because we are greedy and selfish. Period.
Well, my closing remarks, I would say that the scramble for Africa is definitely underway. And as for Zimbabwe itself specifically, this started soon after independence. And the Chinese have had 40 years to consolidate their position in Zimbabwe. We still have the opportunity to end the Zanu PF dictatorship because the country is still committed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. So far, they've managed to rig the elections and get away with it for two main reasons. The opposition, MDC, Triple C, have failed to implement even one token reform in the last 24 years, including the 5 years in the GNU. And post the GNU, they've been participating in flawed elections, knowing fully well that Zanu PF was rigging the elections, and knowing fully well that Zanu PF would get legitimacy. They've been doing it out of greed. Our only way to break this vicious cycle is to stop participating in flawed elections. Chamisa and company have got the incentive to participate, to continue to participate out of greed. But the ordinary Zimbabweans have got to realize that it is sheer futility participating in these flawed elections. We can stop this madness. Last year, people participated. 2 million people voted for Chamisa because they believed his idiotic lie that he had plugged the vote rigging loopholes. Of course, he had not done so. And he was the first one to admit it soon after the elections started pouring in, accusing Zanu PF of rigging the elections. I think the people of Zimbabwe have got to learn fast. If you're going to stop this catastrophic situation we find ourselves in, where 40 years ago, we were an upper middle income country. Now we are one of the poorest. This scramble for Africa, as far as China is concerned, Zimbabwe is a colony of China in all but name. The other day, last week, we showed a video of lorries ferrying lithium and chrome to the port in Mozambique to be exported to China. Diamonds, the same thing. Gold, the same thing. Meanwhile, the countries get benefiting nothing from it. Mnangagwa and company are benefiting from it because they use some of the proceeds of the wholesale looting that is taking place to bankroll the regime's operations. I repeat, we can stop this if we stop participating in flawed elections. 2028 is around the corner. We have to educate some of the naive, gullible, and ignorant MDC CCC supporters that they are not doing the nation any favors at all by participating in these flawed elections. That is the challenge this nation, the number one challenge this nation is facing. We are already a colony of China in all but name. Thank you very much. And Ben, thank you very much. And we'll meet you tomorrow. Good night.
Good night to you all.